Good morning. I'm following on with some more of the GemStone tie-in related, but also looking at Pharo. So this is PharoGs hosting the Pharo class library, a Pharo class environment and image in GemStone S. So we'll be looking at the motivation for doing this, GemStone namespaces that make it possible, the process that we go through to do it, demo, look at the IDE, then some questions. So the motivation, what's prompting this, or why does this seem like an interesting thing? Presumably, there's someone who thinks it's a good idea. So that prompted, well, so what would it look like to do it? How would we go about doing that? So could we execute Pharo code inside GemStone? And presumably part of the motivation for this is to be able to develop in Pharo and deploy in GemStone. And many people are already doing that. The challenge with that is, or the value in that is you can use your familiar IDE, get started just in the place you're used to working there in Pharo. And then as things scale up, you want to go into production. I think Dale coined the phrase 15 years ago of develop in Pharo, deploy in GemStone. Scale up the image, all the things Norm was discussing, terabytes of your object space, thousands of sessions, a shared object space with transactional persistence, and the industrial strength reliability. Typical way of doing this currently is to use something like Grease, so a portability layer, where built on top of the kernel classes, you have this basic layer where you can say, if I want to use sockets, I don't use the Pharo sockets, I use the Grease sockets. If I want to do file systems, I don't use the Pharo files, I use the Grease files. And that works reasonably well, but the challenge with a compatibility library or portability is you rarely put it in from the start. You only go to it later, and in many cases with libraries or something, it will be ported by someone else who thinks, oh, well, this was neat in Pharo, I'd like to take it somewhere else. And so then they have to rewrite it. It's rarely done from the start. So what you'd really like is, what if you could do the full class library and just have it be Pharo all the way down? Of course, that's for some definition of full. And so there's always some little asterisk that says, well, how far can you go? But the point of this is to see how far can we go. Other possible motivations, well, currently we're looking at hosting Pharo 8.0 in GemStone 3.5, but if you could have one guest, why not two? And so could you have an environment where you could run Pharo 7 and Pharo 8 in the same object space? And, or another dialect of Smalltalk. So for a proof of concept, at least, this is something intriguing to think about. Another value for this that I see, and I'm interested to hear what the people who are thinking about this think would be valuable, is we can use the GemStone IDE to look at non-GemStone code. And so here you can take a minimal Pharo image, one that does not have the full development environment, does not have debuggers and inspectors, but you can still debug, inspect, browse code. So gives you a chance to say, do some research into how minimal an image could I get without some of the challenges. And there are ways of addressing this. I was talking to someone who's working on a minimal image using mirrors or reflection or some of the other capabilities here. But That's sort of this indirect model. Here we can actually directly see and manipulate code, but not have it be part of the built-in image. So this gives us an opportunity to research what is truly kernel or minimal. What is the minimum size that you could get? What do you need to run? And you can try running it in this environment. Yes?
Do you think it could be possible to simulate RPC with 2 different images within GemStone?
So simulate remote procedure call using 2 GemStone images. So I'd need to know more of what you want from RPC, but the typical model that when we talk about RPC, we're talking about a remote gem for example, a VisualWorks client. And so that would be one. Another thing, though, if you wanted to do communication between two images, so that's sort of an RPC call, yes, you could simulate something like this by just as we're hosting two class libraries, you could, if you wanted to, create 2 images and have them in the same object space and communicate to each other as a process. And we'll look a little bit at how the Pharo image communicates with the GemStone image here. So a bit of that, yes. So how do we make this possible? What's the way of doing it? So let's look at the namespaces that give us an opportunity, globals and methods. In the traditional Smalltalk and a basic Pharo sort of model or others, you have the image with then a set of globals. But the globals is a single symbol dictionary that has a series of global associations which have keys and values. And the compiled method points to the association that then has a way of doing the lookup on the value. In GemStone, we have the repository. The top-level object is the list of users. Norm mentioned the security by login, visibility, shared spaces, and private spaces. So each user has not just one dictionary, but a list of them. And so we can create a new symbol dictionary, and I've named it Pharo in my work, to hold the Pharo Globals. So there is a GemStone symbol dictionary that has the GemStone Globals and a Pharo symbol dictionary that has the Pharo Globals. Then we can put into that new dictionary the classes and globals that are coming over from Pharo, even if they have the same name, because it's a separate dictionary. So the ordered collection that exists in Pharo, or in the Pharo hosted Pharo, is different from the ordered collection that exists in GemStone. Same name, but a different class. Though there are a few classes that need to be shared, literals and others that are known to the VM, so there will be a block closure, strings, small integers. These are things that are actually known to the VM along with behavior, class, meta class, process scheduler, semaphore. These are things that actually are known to the VM and need to be the same class. But they can still be in separate dictionaries because you can have the same key. And so small integer appears in both dictionaries and points to the same class. And that's fine. But that brings us to the question of what if we want the methods to be different? There's a different implementation, for example, of print-on. So in GemStone, print-on behaves one way. In Pharo, print-on behaves another way. We need to be able to support both. You need to be able to send a message to a small integer, to an array, and get different behaviors. GemStone has a feature where we have multiple method namespaces. So in traditional Smalltalks, each class has one method dictionary. In GemStone, each class can have over 250 method dictionaries. And when you execute code, you specify either implicitly or explicitly which method dictionary to use. And by default, it's going to use the GemStone method dictionary, but that would be the default case is 0. This feature was actually put into GemStone some years ago to support Ruby for something called maglev. And so environment 1 is reserved for maglev, but 2 on are available. So I'm using environment 2 in my work for Pharo. Yes. Microphone's coming if you'd like.
Does it mean you need a new environment for each Pharo version, or can they coexist in one environment?
So each guest class each guest needs to have its own environment if it wants to have separate methods. So this is a namespace sort of model. If I'm hosting Pharo 8.0, and so that's going to be in namespace 2. If I wanted to host 8.0 and 7. Something, then I would go to namespace 3. If I wanted to have 3 class libraries in one namespace, then I would need to have 3 environments. If I wanted to have 6, on the other hand, the fact that I'm using environment 2 doesn't mean that environment 2 can't be used by you in a separate GemStone repository. So my repository, I happen to be using environment 2. If you have a different repository, you can host Pharo 7, you could host something else, completely different. So, yes. Yes, the microphone's coming, I guess, so we'll hang on to that. Though, I will say I've got a few slides describing this coming. Go ahead.
If you're in one default environment and you want to execute code using the other environment, how do you specify it?
We'll come to that. Yes. So the traditional model, each class has one method dictionary. That's what we have here. In GemStone, each class has an array of method dictionaries. So you can see the array class has a method dictionary 0 and 2, and that inherits from sequenceable collections. So when we're sending messages, we can go to method dictionary 2. We can even insert new classes. So GemStone array inherits from sequenceable collection. In Pharo, array inherits from arrayed collection. So I need to insert a new class into the inheritance hierarchy. GemStone provides a way to do that. So you'll notice here, arrayed collection is not in the class inheritance, but it's in the method inheritance for environment 2. So we can do that. Now, how do we make calls from one to the other? This was your question. So implicit, if you're in environment 0 and you say array print string, you get the environment 0 implementation. In environment 2, if you execute the same code, you get the environment 2 implementation. But there's also a way of being explicit. So we have this somewhat odd syntax, but you need some way of doing it. So if you say at environment 0, you can specify which environment you wish to go into for things. So that's the syntax for going from one to the other, which is the way most of the code I've written works, because I'm taking the lowest level Pharo code and then making calls into GemStone to provide some of the lower level process. So let's look briefly at the steps I went through to get this working, the hosting process, preparing the Pharo image, creating GemStone files, loading to GemStone, editing methods, and run tests, rinse and repeat. So preparing the Pharo image, I'm basing this on a minimal Pharo image, and I've done a certain amount of edits to Pharo, and thanks to the community for your patience in my process going through this. I've gotten some help and some guidance from people. I've submitted 35 pull requests, all of which, as of this week, have been accepted. So thank you to Pharo for that. With that, much of that is cleanup of things that are legal in Pharo, but not legal in GemStone. And one of the prime examples would be 2 periods in a row. And so in Pharo, there's half a dozen methods that had a period at the end of a comment. And that's legal, but not really intentional. And so there was little controversy in accepting those pull requests. There were some where in Pharo, there's the syntactic sugar of being able to send a symbol instead of a block. And in GemStone, for specifically the if not nil, a special selector that is recognized by the compiler as being inlined, the compiler actually checks to say, is this a block? If it's not, it's a compile error. So there's a few places where I've asked if we could replace the symbol with a block, and in a few places we've done that. Yes, I should. And I should have more than 24 hours in a day. I should have more than 7 days in a week. I should have, and what I tell my children every time, or grandchildren, every time they say, but I say, well, I want a pony. And I don't get a pony. So if you would like to provide resources for us to change GemStone to suit you, we'll be all ears. We will talk about that, though. So the minimal image is being used to reduce the porting effort. You know, I have to start somewhere, but that still gives me 1,500 classes, 25,000 methods, 500 primitives, and I even there need to load a few additional packages. So Monticello, SUnit, and some tests. So I've loaded and created a Pharo image that I want to work from. I export everything into a GS format, into a GemStone format. And this creates a series of files, a couple thousand files, that I can then import. 1,800 classes, 30,000 methods. And then there's a few fixes that I'm doing on the file out process. The GemStone does not accept certain punctuation characters as symbols in a literal array, but things that I know, and then I recognize Pharo primitives and mark those with pragmas. So I'm putting in a series of pragmas as I'm exporting things so that I can do some cleanup. There's 30 classes that have the same name, and you'll see things like array, class, meta object, pragma, semaphore, and a number of them are exceptions, errors that are signaled from the virtual machine, so we need to be careful with those. There's 16 classes that actually are mapped to the identical class, but with different names. And so arithmetic error in Pharo is mapped to numeric error. So you can still call it arithmetic error. In your code, you can say on arithmetic error, do this. But the name refers to an object, and it's the object that is used. Then load into Pharo. I create a Pharo global, pools. I add a global. We do not support this context, so I need to add a global so at least things will compile. Load the 1,800 classes, 30,000 methods, and then reassign some superclasses. As we mentioned, array inherits from arrayed class. Then do some initialization. So the classes are there, but the class variables, the pools are not all set up correctly. So we do some initialization. And here's where we're finding some interesting gotchas of, there's some things in Pharo that the initialization process is a little incomplete. So far and then we load in modifications to methods. So far I've modified several hundred methods, but again, out of 30,000, I don't consider this too excessive, and they're at a fairly low level. So for example, there's over 500 primitives. Obviously, the primitives are going to be different. So I've done the grunt work of just stepping through each primitive. I'm going to do something else. But for integers, it's just a different primitive number. And so a number of things translated fairly easily. Some things I'm leaving in at the moment as just, this is not implemented yet. So there's a number of things that are just set up intentionally as errors. We don't support that yet. Tests, I've imported a number of tests just to see if I can work my way through the process. Integer, float, number, scale, decimal, Boolean, true, false, undefined, file, sockets, a few things. So we have a number of tests that are just passing through that. Then I turn my attention to, could I get Seaside to load? What would it take to do that? So Monticello, new, Metacello, new, baseline of Seaside, repository, load. And with the exception of one method that I needed to change, we're now able to run that. So let's see if we can run through our demo of that. See if I can get my mouse cursor. Here we are. Okay, yes. That mouse is the one in the recording. So it won't move. So PharoGs, motivation, approach, some limitations, development process, discussion, which we've gone through here. So we're going to start with launching a GemStone. So here I have my GemStone on the Mac, version 3.5. I'm going to take a database and in order to restore a backup, pick a place to put it, initialize the base extent, replace the one that's already there. When that's done, I'll start the database, and this then brings up the database running. Go back to my instructions, see what's the next step. So the next step is open a terminal on the appropriate GemStone environment and set up a place to load things in. So from GemStone, I can say go to a login, give myself a terminal, and change directory into my PharoGs code. And there's a script, there's a GS list, so my stones are running. Git remote v shows the code that I have. I'm up to date. Here's the local environment. And I have a Topaz ini that gives me a login. So I can go in and get my export from Pharo script. So I have a script that says go out, get a Pharo minimal image, and install it, install a number of Monticello packages, including my tests and some other things, then export to files, these various files. And so here are the things I've added. Here are the things that have been exported, including, again, our 1,800 classes, 30,000 methods. Then I can go import that into GemStone. So GemStone, I have a series of steps of install this, initialize that, run this, and here we have a number of tests. If we look at Seaside then, we can go in, grab a script that says Metacello load, and run that. It will step through going out to the internet, grabbing all the things. And again, this is Pharo code that's running. This is the... And we can run then a series of tests. So the WA context test is one that has several hundred tests, 733. So those all run, all pass. I have a handful of failing tests. So on the grease layer, capitalization of umlauts, I couldn't get Unicode properly installed in my Pharo environment, but didn't spend a lot of time on it. There's a few handful of things that rely on this context, which is something we would need to investigate further. There's a form test that relies on ellipse morph, which is not in a base image. But overall for Seaside, I have 1,473 tests passing, 4 failures, 18 errors. So I think that's a pretty good process. There is one method I need to add. This is the one that deals with partial continuations. So I go into Topaz, add this one method, commit, and then from there, go back to my notes for Seaside, grab the script that says WA Server Manager, start all. So I'm going to go in, run that script, WA Server Manager, start all, and then switch over to a browser, type in localhost, and Seaside comes up. I can go to the counter and step through the counter example. So this gives us Pharo's Seaside code running hosted in the GemStone environment. And again, the continuations are giving us the correct answers. So that is the video demo. I'm going to then say, let's take a look at the IDE. And so with that, I have an IDE, and I'm sorry, the font's a little small, but here I have, looking at Pharo, here are the Pharo Globals. I could also be looking at the GemStone Globals, but here I have a Pharo class library. These are all the methods that are in Pharo that have been imported that I'm looking at here. I can have a GemStone workspace that does a array print string. I can have a Pharo workspace that does an array print string. So I can run the same code in 2 different workspaces and have it execute different code. For purposes of time, I'm not going to go into the debugger and things, but see me afterwards. Debugger, inspectors, these things all work. So again, this is a proof of concept. Can it be done? And I think yes, it can be done. Next, what are the challenges? And part of this research is to discover what are the challenges. Yes, there are challenges. GemStone, the compiler, is built in to the virtual machine. So I'm not running the Pharo compiler. And there's things we could look at for that. There is a way of providing an AST to GemStone and installing it. That's been done. FFI is, of course, going to be a challenge. GemStone has one, Pharo has one. I could create a bridge between them. This context is something that GemStone doesn't have, and I need to solve that. I've got some ideas that I need to discuss with the people who are more into the VM engineering. Slots and traits, GemStone doesn't support. We need to look at a way of doing that. But overall, you know, at least we've got something. So what's the motivation? What's the future here? Well, my motivation for this is in the academic context. And in the academic world, you need to do research, publish, have degrees, and things like this. So I'm pursuing this because I'm hoping to impress Steph. And so there's my motivation. This is not a GemStone-sponsored project, certainly not officially, but I think you all understand that GemStone is very responsive to the community interests and has done a lot to support Pharo, particularly Dale's initiatives. So if there's interest, you know, talk to us, particularly talk to Norm. But you see there are a number of things on the roadmap. How does this go? If you'd like to look at the code, go to GitHub. It's there, PharoGs, or you could just Google PharoGs, and several of the hits will be there. So I have a minute maybe for questions. And there's a couple people with microphones if you have. Otherwise, I'm going to let you see that. I'm going to disconnect and let the next speaker start getting connected. Any questions? Does it look like fun?